Discounting handheld games and mini-episodes, there have been 6 main entries in the Ratchet & Clank series that all seem to play very similarly. Or if you do want to include those other games, 9 very similar games. So it's no surprise that Insomniac wanted to try something different for the next installment. As such, All for One swapped out the single-player aspect of previous games for a co-op focused experience, because that worked so well for Alone in the Dark, and Assassin's Creed, and Call of Juarez, and Dead Space, and Epic Mickey, and Fear, and Lost Planet, and Resident Evil, and... The story this time round involves Ratchet, Clank, Captain Quark, and Dr. Nefarious teaming up to stop the Doctor's latest evil scheme that's gotten out of control, and ending up being abducted by a crazed collector and stuck on a strange planet. Now the four must team up to find a way back home, and rescue all the innocent creatures also trapped. Straight off the bat, the plot is a massive step back from previous games. Not every Ratchet & Clank game has to have a grand epic story, but the ones that came before had such strong narratives that this one would probably have felt weak whatever it was. But even on its own merits, the overall story is paper thin, while the actual characters and motivations are surprisingly overly complex and difficult to even summarize. It's a weird mishmash of being straightforward and complicated, and it doesn't work either way. Basically though, it's just an excuse plot, designed more to explain why the characters are working together and keep moving to different locations, and it honestly shouldn't have tried to be anything more than that, because when it does, we end up with attempts at character development like Ratchet wanting to retire from the heroing business, because that always makes for an entertaining gaming experience, doesn't it? Still, all that could be forgiven if the gameplay is solid, surely. Unfortunately, it isn't, and don't call me Shirley. Think that joke was old? Now you know what it's like listening to the main characters spout the same one-liners over and over again. If there's one word that best describes this game, it's repetitive. Much more so than previous games. Rather than view the experience from a third-person perspective, as usual, this game uses a fixed camera, presumably so that all 4 characters can fit on the screen. The difference this makes cannot be understated, because it means that this simply doesn't feel like a Ratchet & Clank game. If anything, it feels more like any other generic arcade-style co-op shooter, albeit one with a bad camera, since this one will often fail to follow you properly, especially if there are multiple players and some are further behind than the others. The fixed camera also makes the platforming of the game much more frustrating. It's often hard to judge where you are and where you'll land after a jump, so you'll inadvertently jump to your doom far more often than you'd like, though the co-op gameplay does mean you'll probably pop right back with no repercussions, which does not feel right at all. Something else that doesn't feel right are the controls. Instead of being able to manually aim your weapons with pinpoint accuracy, the fixed camera means you're at the mercy of a lock-on system that isn't all that brilliant, making combat boil down to trial and error at worst and generic and uninspired at best. It doesn't help that gunplay has been stripped down significantly compared to earlier games. There's still a few imaginative weapons, but most don't feel particularly entertaining to use, and you'll often end up just using the basic machine gun equivalent, since it works just as well at the start of the game as it does at the end, and the upgrades do very little to change anything. Speaking of, the upgrade system has been changed in this game as well. Your weapons no longer level up through being used. Instead, you can purchase a mere 3 upgrades per weapon: increased damage, increased ammo, and a mystery upgrade. This third upgrade tends to be absurdly expensive and often makes a weapon worse, such as the main machine gun being transformed from a single-shot weapon into a widespread triple-shot gun that burns through ammo at an alarming rate, with no real benefit most of the time. The co-op element also means that interacting with other players is crammed in wherever the developers could fit it, so you'll often find yourself bogged down with switches that need multiple people to activate, or enemies that are more easily defeated when everyone shoots them at the same time. Even the old-school art of using the swing shot doesn't escape, as players now swing on the backs of each other. It's surface-level co-op at its most blatant. If you're playing with other people in the same room, you'll have a much easier time of things. If you're not all on the same wavelength, you'll end up trying to figure out what each other is doing, which won't be much fun if you're just trying to play the game and they're busy off trying to get achievements or whatever. And since I mentioned achievements, they're back, but some of them are almost impossible to accomplish in single-player mode, which means you probably won't bother. This is the first game in the series where I didn't attempt to get them all, simply because I flat out couldn't. And I've gotten some of the most frustrating achievements these games have thrown at me, so that kind of says it all. There's also hidden collectibles, but they just are not costumes that you can barely see anyway since the camera's zoomed out so far, and aren't used in the pre-rendered cutscenes, so there's not really much point. And there are also collectible critters, which you'll need to unlock the game's ultimate weapon. Though since you can freely replay levels in the same manner as Ratchet Deadlocked, and simply recollect the critters each time, it's absurdly easy to save up hundreds of them, rendering the feature much less effective. And since I mentioned the levels, I should also say there's way too many of them, and despite the game being based around quick-paced in-and-out multiplayer, the levels themselves go on for ages. Of all the Ratchet & Clank games that would have benefited from being short and sweet, this would be it. But instead, it's as long as a typical game, despite the gameplay style being wholly unsuited for it. I know it seems like I'm being overly negative here, and I probably am. I'm not the biggest fan of co-op games, so I'm no doubt skewed against this game by default. Hell, if this wasn't a Ratchet & Clank game, I'd probably never have played it at all. But it is a Ratchet & Clank game, and that means the bar's been raised pretty damn high, so it's all the more disappointing when a game doesn't even come close to reaching that bar. All for One may be a decent enough co-op shooter, but as an entry in a primarily single-player franchise, it's a fundamentally different experience that simply doesn't live up to the games that came before it. I really wanted to like this game, but I can't. And that makes me very sad indeed.